Today I'm making a demonstration video on a very beautiful flute that is new to my collection and probably in my top 10 flutes, I would say. This is a 5-key flute built by Jean Tulou, the famous flutist and pedagogue. He was the professor for a long time at the Paris Conservatoire, wrote very famous treatise on playing the flute and contributed greatly to the instrument making of French flutes. For a period of about 20 years, Jean Tulou had a flute making shop with Jacques Nonon. I think Nonon was probably really the flute maker, and Tulou helped to design the flutes, especially adding special features to the instruments. Unlike my other flute by Tulou, this one is very conservative in terms of the basic features. It has the 5 keys, the B flat key, the G sharp key, the C key, the short F key, and the D sharp key. Many of Toulou's flutes had an extra key for the F sharp, which raised the pitch of the F sharp above the slightly low pitch that we get from this. His idea was to have an equal tempered F sharp in addition to an F sharp that was more pure with D. This was typical of the 19th century. People were thinking about equal temperament and trying to use equal temperament, but also trying to play in tune, having good thirds at the same time. So his flutes often would give you various options about where that note was placed. Tulou was not a big fan of the long F key. The long F key was used so that you could play an F natural using a key with your little finger on your left hand, and that was because in order to get over here to this F key, you have to lift your finger up off of your D. So if you have to go D to F and it's under a slur, you're in trouble unless you have the long F key over here. However, Tulou tuned his flutes so that one could play a cross-fingered F natural just like we did on the Baroque flute and on the classical flute before the F key came along. And in fact, on this flute, this works extremely well. It's perfectly well in tune, and you can pretty much go back and forth between these different Fs. So with the key, so there's really virtually no difference. He also has quite a good F sharp without using the opening the F natural key as we normally do. So with the key, our different choices would be, they're really extremely close together. So one can use quite a variety of fingerings with the right hand. This flute has a very special feature. In my collection, it's the only flute that has this, and that is a device called a tuning ring. And the idea of the tuning ring is that it provides a spacer on the inside of the flute here so that the flute can be pulled out to make the pitch lower, but the spacer keeps there from being a space in the head. Now, interestingly, a lot of French flutes at this time, including, I would imagine, other flutes that he made, there was kind of a little ledge on the inside that kind of accomplished the same thing as these spacers. But on this particular flute, we have original spacers. So this is a spacer for the inside, and then there's also a spacer here for the outside. And the idea of that is that when you put your flute together, instead of looking like this being pulled out, it just looks like a silver ring across the whole space. And even more unusual is that this flute contains 2 spacers for the right hand. Normally we don't pull out the right hand joint, but Tulou obviously thought that if you were going to pull out this joint, you also ought to pull out the right hand slightly. So it's a smaller spacer, which just fits on the inside. And in this case, with that spacer on the inside, the silver lines up properly. There is a second spacer for the right hand, where you can make this even a little farther. So I'm playing it with the head joint spacer and the right hand spacer. The normal pitch of this flute without any of that extra stuff is in the area of 430. This is not a 435 flute, which is kind of interesting. And with these spacers in, it's more like 425. I didn't test it today, but it is pretty low for French Romantic flute. And I would date this flute from around 1840, maybe to 1845. I believe that Toulou's flute making ended in 1853 when Nonon went off and started his own shop. So I think it has to be before that time. It's extremely elegant, beautiful, dark crocus wood, silver keys with hallmarks. It has an original case with the original swab and the original cork grease and original screwdriver, plus these tuning rings. So it's quite a unique example. And in terms of playing, it works extremely well over the entire range. It's very, very sweet sound. You can tell that it loves to play up high, which was typical of the music at the time. For my examples, I'm going to start with a piece called Romanza de Joconde from Toulouse Recreation Musicales, Opus 63. This is really a style of flute writing that was made for amateur players rather than for the students at the Paris Conservatoire. So I can play it. Much of Toulouse music is extremely difficult. The next thing I would like to play are 2 movements from Berbiguier's Opus 42 solos for flute. So I'm going to play an Adagio movement from the first solo and an Allegro, poco, assai e con gusto from the second solo. I hope you enjoy this flute.